In the quiet, dimming streets of Laredo, Texas, a seemingly ordinary evening quickly spiraled into a desperate and dangerous escape that would capture the attention of law enforcement and the public alike. What began as a routine traffic stop turned into a high-speed pursuit, a life-threatening swim across the Rio Grande, and a series of decisions that would lead to serious criminal charges. At the center of this chaotic scene was Brenda Castro, a woman whose attempts to evade the law would force her to confront not only the dire consequences of her actions but also the fine line between survival and recklessness. As the story unfolds, it becomes a striking reminder of the human toll of desperation, the risks involved in attempting to outrun the law, and the complex moral choices that individuals face when caught between fear and hope. The sun was beginning to set over the vast, rugged landscape of the Texas border, casting long shadows across the water. A seemingly ordinary day was about to turn into something that would capture the attention of many and raise questions about desperation, law, and the lengths some would go to evade capture. In a tense encounter near the Rio Grande, a woman, whose identity remains hidden under the veil of her criminal actions, was apprehended by border authorities after a daring escape attempt. What seemed to be a typical Border Patrol operation turned into a dramatic pursuit, testing both the resolve of the authorities and the woman's determination to flee at any cost. This woman, already under suspicion for transporting 5 illegal immigrants in her vehicle, wasn't going down without a fight. As the law closed in, she made a chilling decision, one that would put her own life, as well as the life of a child, at risk. In a desperate bid to evade arrest, she ditched her vehicle and sprinted towards the Rio Grande, the dividing line between the United States and Mexico, hoping to escape into the unknown. But it wasn't just her fate that hung in the balance. In her arms, she carried an infant, an innocent life caught up in a situation that had spiraled out of control. As she plunged into the swift current of the Rio Grande, the weight of her choices began to sink in. This was not just a flight from the law, but a frantic attempt to break free from a tangled web of circumstances that she no longer knew how to navigate. As the woman swam with the infant in tow, the authorities were forced to make split-second decisions. The moment stretched into eternity as officers weighed the risk of pursuit versus the safety of the child. Meanwhile, the 5 immigrants who had been crammed into the vehicle were left behind, their fates now uncertain. This dramatic moment near the Rio Grande encapsulates a much larger, often misunderstood issue at the heart of America's ongoing immigration crisis. Behind every desperate attempt to cross, every escape and every flight from the law, there are human stories shaped by hardship, hope, and the pursuit of something better. But was it worth the risk? What drove this woman to take such extreme measures? As authorities continue to investigate, the questions surrounding this daring escape attempt remain unanswered, pointing to a deeper story of survival, fear, and the unyielding forces that drive people to make decisions they might never have thought possible. The border town of Laredo, known for its bustling trade routes and the constant ebb and flow of people, had become the setting for a high-stakes pursuit on the cold winter evening of December 19th. The Ford Explorer, its windows slightly fogged from the warmth inside, sped down the highway, defying the flashing lights of the Texas Department of Public Safety, DPS, troopers who had signaled for it to pull over. Brenda Castro, sitting quietly in the passenger seat, might have thought the night would be like any other, but it was anything but ordinary. Her husband, an American citizen, was behind the wheel, his actions setting off a chain of events that would soon escalate into a dangerous confrontation. As the troopers' lights grew brighter in the rearview mirror, there was an unmistakable sense of urgency in the air, but the driver's foot pressed harder on the gas pedal rather than easing up on the brake. What led to his refusal to stop is still a matter of investigation, but the choice to flee would set the stage for what would become a chaotic chase. The vehicle weaved through Laredo's streets, its tires screeching against the asphalt, as the troopers followed, determined to stop the car before it reached the city's more desolate outskirts. The sound of sirens pierced the night, growing louder, echoing through the narrow streets and quiet neighborhoods. Brenda, still sitting passively in the passenger seat, found herself swept up in a situation that quickly spiraled out of control. What had started as an ordinary drive through the city was now a reckless flight from law enforcement, with consequences hanging in the balance. The tension was palpable in the vehicle, and as the situation intensified, Brenda could only watch as her husband's decisions began to change the course of their lives. The chase was not just an evasion of law enforcement, it was a dramatic demonstration of a dangerous crossroads. What was going through Brenda's mind in those tense moments? Was she aware of what was unfolding? Was there a moment of hesitation, or did she, too, feel trapped in a situation she had no control over? As the Ford Explorer continued its erratic journey, the stakes grew higher. The troopers were not going to let the vehicle escape without intervention. Meanwhile, Brenda's presence in the passenger seat added another layer to the narrative, one that would complicate the situation even further, especially when the ultimate reason for their flight would be uncovered. But what had truly driven her husband to make this rash decision? Were they involved in something larger than just a simple traffic stop? And where did this wild escape plan lead? These questions loomed as the story continued to unfold, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary chase, and Brenda Castro was at the heart of a drama that was yet to reach its conclusion. The tension of the pursuit heightened as the high-speed chase raged on through the darkened streets of Laredo. Dashcam footage, later released by the Texas Department of Public Safety, DPS, painted a terrifying picture of the frantic escape. The Ford Explorer, now fully engaged in evading capture, hurtled down residential roads and rural highways at dangerously high speeds, dodging through neighborhoods and racing against the clock. Each turn brought the vehicle closer to the border, to the Rio Grande, and to an uncertain fate. The streets of Laredo, usually quiet under the cover of night, seemed almost eerily still, as though the town itself was holding its breath, watching the drama unfold. The roar of the SUV's engine echoed through the emptiness, a stark contrast to the flashing red and blue lights trailing behind. As the vehicle swerved to avoid obstacles, the urgency of the situation became impossible to ignore. It was clear that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of panic, this was a desperate, life-or-death escape. Then, the unthinkable happened. In a move that would shock the authorities, Brenda Castro, who had been seated quietly in the passenger seat just moments before, leapt out of the vehicle, clutching an infant in her arms. The footage captures her swift decision to abandon the car, to jump into the unknown. With no time to waste, she bolted towards the Rio Grande, the dividing line between the United States and Mexico, and plunged into the chilling waters. Her husband's vehicle, now abandoned and left in the dust, continued to race through the streets, unaware of the magnitude of the choice his wife had just made. Brenda's leap into the river was nothing short of reckless, yet it was driven by an overpowering desperation. The Rio Grande, its waters flowing quickly and violently, was not a safe haven, but a formidable barrier. As she swam across the river, clutching the infant tightly against her chest, the authorities were faced with a choice that no one should ever have to make. The chase had now evolved into a race against time, not just to apprehend the fleeing suspects, but to ensure the safety of an innocent child caught in a dangerous, unpredictable situation. For the DPS officers trailing the Ford Explorer, this new development added an unimaginable layer of complexity. Their primary objective had been to stop the vehicle and apprehend its occupants, but now they had to make a split-second decision: continue the chase on land or try to intervene in the perilous situation unfolding at the riverbank. The stakes had escalated, and what had started as a routine traffic stop had quickly turned into a high-risk, high-speed rescue mission. As Brenda swam toward the Mexican side of the border, her every stroke was a desperate plea for escape, her every move more perilous than the last. The infant in her arms, an innocent bystander in this chaotic drama, seemed to symbolize the innocence lost in the pursuit of freedom. Could they make it safely across? Could the authorities prevent a tragedy from unfolding? The answers hung in the balance as the events continued to unfold in the dead of night, with the river, its powerful currents, and the fear of what lay ahead serving as the backdrop to a story of escape, desperation, and uncertainty. What had led Brenda to make such a choice, and would she and the infant survive this treacherous journey? The world watched, uncertain of the answers, as this story took yet another dramatic turn. As Brenda Castro struggled to keep herself and the infant afloat in the fast-moving waters of the Rio Grande, the situation had already taken yet another dramatic turn. Her husband, following his own desperate course of action, had also swum across the river, narrowly making it to the Mexican side of the border. The once high-speed chase had now morphed into an international incident, with both individuals facing a far more complex set of consequences than they could have ever anticipated. The DPS spokesperson, speaking to Fox News Digital, confirmed the chaotic developments. While Brenda's husband had made it to the other side, his flight into Mexico marked a critical point in the story. Having successfully crossed the river, he now found himself on foreign soil, but his escape came with its own set of ramifications. Mexico, as always, held its own set of laws and agreements with the U.S., and authorities would soon have to deal with the diplomatic and legal complexities of his presence there. But that was for later. For now, the focus was entirely on Brenda. Meanwhile, back on the U.S. side, state and local law enforcement were already reacting with swift professionalism, directing Brenda to return to the American side of the border. The situation had gone beyond a mere pursuit of a criminal. It had turned into a potential life-or-death scenario, especially with the infant involved. The authorities' calls for her to come back across the river were firm but measured, understanding the delicate balance they had to strike between law enforcement and compassion. The officers, some of whom had witnessed the harrowing moments as Brenda leapt from the moving vehicle and swam into the river, were now positioned along the riverbank. With tensions still running high, they communicated directly with her, imploring her to return to safety. They made it clear that they were there not only to enforce the law but to protect the lives at risk of hers, the children's, and possibly others still to be accounted for. After what must have felt like an agonizing moment of decision, Brenda, possibly realizing the weight of her choices and the danger she had put herself and her child in, finally made the decision to comply. With exhaustion likely setting in from the long swim and the tension of the chase, she began the slow, difficult journey back to the U.S. side. The authorities, now relieved that no further escalation would occur, apprehended her the moment she stepped onto American soil. In an ironic twist, it was the border itself that now defined their fate both literally and figuratively. While her husband remained across the river in Mexico, Brenda's actions, from the escape to the desperate swim, had sealed her path toward a very different reality. She was arrested shortly after emerging from the river, the gravity of her decision settling in. The child, still clutched in her arms, was thankfully unharmed and handed over to protective services, where she would be cared for until a more permanent solution could be found. The escape attempt, in its final moments, left a mix of relief and concern hanging in the air, relief that the child was safe, but concern over the choices made and the potential legal consequences that would follow. For Brenda Castro, this was far from over. What began as a reckless act of desperation would now lead to questions of intent, judgment, and the larger forces at play. As authorities began to piece together the story behind the flight from the law, it was clear that the ripple effects of this escape would be felt long after the chase had ended. The scene along the riverbank was one of intense urgency and overwhelming emotions. As Brenda Castro struggled through the swift currents of the Rio Grande, with the infant still clutched tightly in her arms, the sound of law enforcement officers' voices rang out across the water. In Spanish, they shouted commands, urging her to return to the U.S. side of the border, their voices filled with a mix of authority and desperation. "Vuelve a la tierra firme, con el niño," they cried, their words piercing through the night air, desperate pleas for Brenda to make the right decision, to not let the current carry her any further into Mexico. The water, cold and powerful, seemed indifferent to the peril that lay ahead, as it rushed past them relentlessly. Yet the officer's instructions were clear: get out of the water, bring the child back to safety. Brenda, visibly exhausted and overwhelmed by the weight of her situation, hesitated for a moment. But the gravity of the moment was undeniable. The sight of the child in her arms, vulnerable and innocent, seemed to make the decision clearer. She had already crossed so many boundaries, both literally and figuratively, but in the face of the law and the safety of her child, she knew what needed to be done. Just as she made the difficult decision to comply, a law enforcement officer, who had no doubt been observing closely, sprang into action. Wading into the water, he reached out to the infant, carefully pulling the child from Brenda's grasp. The officer's actions were swift, but gentle, ensuring the child was safely removed from the perilous waters. As the child was lifted from the current, the officer's expression showed both relief and a deep understanding of the fragile life he had just rescued. For Brenda, there was a moment of surrender as she stood, ankle-deep in the cold, rushing water, watching the child, now safe, being carried away. The overwhelming sense of responsibility she had carried for so long now gave way to the reality of her actions. She was not alone in this escape. The infant had been her anchor through the chaos, but in the end, it was not her actions alone that determined the outcome, it was the compassion and professionalism of the officers that would shape the story's resolution. The officer, now holding the infant securely in his arms, waded back toward the shore, where another group of officers waited, ready to provide immediate care. Meanwhile, Brenda, still standing in the river, was left with the weight of what had transpired. She knew that this was the moment where her choices would no longer be her own to control. The law had caught up with her, but in that instant, the safety of the child was the priority. She had done what was necessary to protect the infant, and in doing so, had perhaps taken the first step toward answering for the desperate, reckless actions that had led her to this point. As the officers escorted her back to the U.S. side of the border, the reality of her arrest began to sink in. She would soon face charges for her involvement in the illegal transport of immigrants, and her decisions on that fateful night would likely follow her for the rest of her life. But for now, the child was safe, and that was a small, hard-earned victory in a situation defined by a complex mix of desperation, law, and human emotion. As Brenda Castro was escorted away from the riverbank, the weight of her decisions seemed to settle heavily upon her. The cold, harsh reality of the situation was inescapable. Her attempts to flee, the dangerous swim across the Rio Grande with an infant in her arms, had put both their lives in jeopardy. It was a moment of recklessness that could have ended tragically, yet somehow, against all odds, the child had been pulled from the water safely. But there were no words of comfort now, only the sharp reprimand of a law enforcement officer who had witnessed it all unfold. "I can't believe you tried to run back with the baby. You both could have drowned," the officer said, his voice tinged with disbelief and concern. As he spoke, Brenda, still in shock from the events of the past few hours, kept her head down, perhaps trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. The officer's words weren't just a criticism, they were a stark reminder of the danger she had placed not only herself in but an innocent life as well. Her grip on the infant had been the one thing keeping her grounded, yet it had also been the thing that could have doomed them both. In her attempt to escape, the mother had become so blinded by fear, desperation, and the desire to flee the law that she had made an unimaginable decision, one that could have resulted in a tragic outcome. But the officer's statement underscored something far deeper. It wasn't just about the reckless act itself, it was about the profound responsibility of parenthood and the decisions that accompany it. Despite the harshness of the moment, the child, now under the care of authorities, was a reminder that, amid the chaos, there had been a silver lining. The innocent life, which had been caught up in a life-or-death flight across international waters, was now safe. The officers, having rescued the child from the perilous waters of the Rio Grande, were already ensuring that the infant was placed under protective care. The little one would be taken to safety, away from the turbulence that had defined the night. As Brenda was placed into the back of a patrol vehicle, the finality of her arrest loomed over her. The doors closed, and with it, her escape plan and any remaining hope of avoiding consequences seemed to dissipate. The pursuit of freedom had come at a steep cost, a cost that was now measured in the arrest of a mother, the safety of a child, and the legal ramifications that would soon follow. But for the child, there was a flicker of hope. Placed under the protective care of authorities, the infant was granted the safety that Brenda, in her desperation, had been trying to achieve. It was a bittersweet moment. For one, a future of uncertainty awaited, while for the other, the consequences of her choices would soon become all too real. As the patrol vehicle sped off into the night, the officer's words still echoed in the cold air, a reminder of the fine line between law and desperation, between life and death, and between a mother's frantic choices and the innocent lives affected by them. As the chaos of that fateful night began to unravel, authorities quickly pieced together the full scope of Brenda Castro's desperate actions. In the aftermath of her arrest, further investigation revealed a disturbing truth: 5 illegal immigrants had been found inside her vehicle. The individuals, likely desperate for a chance to cross the border into the United States, had been crammed into the car in what could only be described as a dangerous and illegal arrangement. The authorities acted swiftly, turning the 5 immigrants over to the U.S. Border Patrol for processing. The smuggling operation, which had seemed like a mere vehicle in the desperate escape, had now come under serious scrutiny. The human trafficking element of this story added another layer of complexity, shedding light on the darker undercurrents of the immigration crisis. For Brenda Castro, the consequences of her actions were now far-reaching. What had started as an attempt to flee from the law with her infant had quickly spiraled into a criminal case far beyond simple evasion. Authorities had charged her with human smuggling, a serious federal offense with long-lasting implications. The charges painted a clear picture of her involvement in orchestrating the illegal transportation of people across the border, a crime that weighed heavily on her conscience and would, undoubtedly, shape her future in profound ways. But it wasn't just the smuggling charges that would haunt Brenda. She was also charged with endangering a child of her own. The decision to carry an infant across a dangerous river, without a clear understanding of the risks, was an act of sheer recklessness. The law, rightly so, viewed this not as an isolated mistake but as a grave misjudgment that endangered the well-being of an innocent child, subjecting them to unnecessary peril. The narrative that had begun with a reckless escape attempt now became a tale of human suffering, misguided choices, and the tragic consequences of trying to outrun the law. The 5 individuals inside Castro's vehicle had been smuggled with the hope of finding a better life, but their journey had now turned into a legal and emotional minefield. The infant, meanwhile, had unknowingly been thrust into a world of danger, its future now uncertain, yet in safer hands, away from the turmoil its mother had created. In the wake of these revelations, the public began to view Castro's actions through a more critical lens. What had motivated her to risk so much to place her own child and these individuals in harm's way? Desperation, fear, and an overwhelming sense of hopelessness seemed to be the driving forces behind her decisions. Yet, despite the personal factors at play, the law was clear: her actions were criminal, and she would have to face the consequences. As Brenda faced the legal ramifications of her actions, the 5 illegal immigrants who had been in her car would likely face their own challenges, as the U.S. Border Patrol took the necessary steps to process them. For the authorities, this case was yet another reminder of the complexities surrounding border control and the harsh realities of human smuggling in an era where the need for control, compassion, and justice all seemed to collide at once. For Brenda, the road ahead would be long, filled with legal battles, personal reckoning, and the harsh reality of what her actions had cost. As the case progressed, the broader questions about immigration, desperation, and the choices people make in times of crisis would continue to echo through the ongoing dialogue about America's immigration system. In the end, Brenda Castro's harrowing escape attempt, driven by a combination of fear, desperation, and misguided judgment, serves as a poignant reminder of the complexities and dangers surrounding human smuggling and illegal immigration. What began as a reckless act of evasion turned into a series of decisions that would forever alter the lives of those involved, most notably, the innocent child caught in the crossfire. The story underscores the fine line between survival instincts and the consequences of lawlessness. While Castro's actions were undoubtedly fueled by the desire to protect herself and her child, the sheer danger of her choices highlights the stark realities of crossing the line into criminal behavior. In her attempt to outrun the law, she put not only her life but also that of her infant, as well as the lives of the 5 immigrants in her vehicle, at risk. The law, while unforgiving, is ultimately there to protect all individuals, especially those who are vulnerable, like children, and this case serves as a reminder of the consequences of prioritizing fear over responsibility. The take-home lesson for viewers is clear: the path of desperation can lead to choices that seem justifiable in the moment but have far-reaching, often tragic, consequences. Whether it is in the context of immigration, smuggling, or any life-altering decision, the importance of understanding the risks, seeking help, and avoiding reckless actions cannot be overstated. This story also brings to light the human side of the immigration crisis, how desperation drives individuals to make choices they would never otherwise consider, and how their lives, as well as the lives of those they encounter, can be irrevocably changed. For authorities, this case is a reflection of the difficult, often dangerous, and morally complex nature of border enforcement. It challenges the balance between enforcing the law and showing empathy to those who, driven by hardship, make desperate decisions. As we look at the bigger picture, it is a call to action to address the root causes of such desperate situations and to find more humane and effective ways to navigate the complex issues of immigration. At its heart, this story is a tragic yet powerful reminder of the importance of thinking through one's actions, considering the consequences, and recognizing that sometimes the greatest risks come not from the law itself, but from the desperation that drives people to make dangerous choices. Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling content and hit the notification bell to stay updated.